Welcome everyone to Bog Panda. Tonight we're going to talk about something that is extremely close to me and very serious. Watch Mojo has put out a list of their picks for the 20 worst game consoles. You know, stealing from that article that I wrote from Yahoo years ago that hundreds of thousands of people read. Thanks, Watch Mojo. I am Dr. Mike at Official Pagan on everything, and joining me always.
I don't know. Somehow you're like the Joseph Smith of bad video games.
I try.
Um, Hi everybody. I'm Kelly at KELLYTHUL on Twitter and Instagram. And not Dr. Mike, and I would greatly appreciate it if you get a chance to subscribe to the Bog Panda YouTube channel. It always helps us out there. Give video to a like. That helps us out a lot. Peruse around. You're going to find a playlist called Hard No, which is the world's shortest podcast, also available on podcast platforms around the universe, but particularly Google podcasts. It's the world's shortest podcast. What could be better than that? Check that out. Check our merchandise out. Lots of good things there. Our merchandise might appear at some point in a film. Who knows? You could be ahead of the curve. Do those types of things. So, yeah, I think I'm done.
So, as I alluded to in the intro, there was a brief period of time, and this is a story for another day, where I wrote articles for websites for money. One of the big ones that I would write for was Yahoo. And I did okay for the article. Like they would give you kind of an idea of how many, views they were looking for on articles. And I was usually above that. But this one article that they specifically asked me to write about the worst game systems was viewed like hundreds of thousands of times, which even at that time for Yahoo, and this was years ago, was extremely high. Like most of their articles would be maybe like a few thousand reads. So this was extraordinarily high for them. So basically, anytime I see a list like this, I always want to read it to see how much it lines up or doesn't with my own picks. A few of mine are on here, but I angered a lot of people when I did this. I created criteria to kind of narrow it down because there's a lot of failed game systems or game systems that just didn't click with me. So I kind of made up certain criteria. And one of them right off the bat that made everybody at the time pretty angry was I excluded the Jaguar from it, which places really high on the Watch Mojo list.
Yes.
And the reason I excluded it is while it was initially a failure, the company that ended up buying the Jaguar off of Atari made it public domain because they just wanted the systems for medical use. So they made the actual like specs and everything public domain, which opened up, not just homebrew, but indie companies who to this day are still putting out fully packaged cartridges and brand new games and all kinds of stuff for it. So it's become like a really big cult thing, the Jaguar scene, like beyond just the normal homebrew thing. There's like a cult following for these games. So I don't consider it like it was an initial failure, but the fact that, 25, 30 years later, they're still manufacturing games for this. This is something that, could potentially reach that, Commodore 64 kind of cult level at some point. So I excluded it entirely. Now, when
Yeah.
you saw
Plus,
this, what did you think?
so it was interesting list. We're gonna have to, if you can do some thinking about and be able to time box about when this article came out. I'd love to go back to the Wayback Machine, see if we can do a little hunting and see if we can scare up the original article, because I think that'd be a cool thing to include a link to at some point. But it's cool that some of it tracked, and I'm wholeheartedly support you not including the Jaguar because so I'm not sure if this list is these are bad video consoles, they are the worst, so sitting on the top of that heap, spoiler alert, gang, Virtual Boy, known and beloved by Bog Panda, we're going to have a Bog Panda branded Virtual Boy before we die, and that's our goal. That's our merchandising.
Virtual Boy Mini, where's it at, Nintendo?
That's right. We've been giving these gifts. VR Sega electromechanical games. We just keep giving and giving, but no one's taking us up on it. But so while not commercially successful initially, to your point, now it's got a heartbeat now. It's doing just fine. And even at the beginning, controller aside, and I recognize the tombstone shaped controller was not a good idea. But controller aside, I mean, I don't think you can put this thing in the worst category, because in terms of capabilities, it was good. And if you get a game or two, and I know it's a beast to code for, but I don't think it belongs. If this is about commercial failure, sure. If it's about worst consoles, I don't buy it. I wouldn't put it in there.
Yeah, another thing that I would exclude, I wasn't even aware that this existed, but there was apparently a consoleized version of the Commodore 64. Obviously, you're talking about a variation on something now, and the Commodore 64 by no means can be called a failure. It's one of the best-selling PCs of all time. They still actively make software for this like 40 years later, and not just homebrew or indie companies. Netflix made a Commodore 64 program a couple years ago. So, this is in no way should anything Commodore 64 be on this list. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, and I hadn't heard of that until going through this list. But this again, I think it's just in the wrong list, because if you wanted to go worst packaging ideas ever,
Yeah.
yeah, let's put out a game system with a box and a controller, and you can play all the Commodore games that nearly 90% require a keyboard for,
Right.
and use no keyboard. And so, I think that's a little bit of the experience we run into with some of the emulation stuff on Super Console X and all that, when you end up in the Sinclair section or even on some of the Amiga stuff. Many of those things were darn handy to have a keyboard for. And so if the bases of all your games, or a great number of your games, are keyboard based, it's probably not a good idea to package it without one.
Yeah, and to a similar point, they have the Turbo Express on there. Turbo Express was a handheld version of TurboGrafx 16. It is the exact same system. It's just a portable monitor that you put the actual cards into. It's not even on different cards or anything, like, because their games weren't on cartridges. They were on like their own proprietary memory cards. You use the exact same memory cards. The problem with it, well, TurboGrafx 16 itself never took off here. The problem with it is these aren't handheld games. They were games that were made to be played on a TV. So some of them just don't translate well, and there's no, like, it doesn't block one game or another or anything like that. So some of them just don't translate to handheld. But again, this is just a variant on another console that they didn't put on the list. So that doesn't make sense to me. And I should, at this point, because I'm being very critical, I love Watch Mojo lists. I was joking in the beginning. I don't think they read my article, or if they did, obviously we differ in our opinions. But I love list shows. That's one of my favorite things. So I thought it'd be fun for Kelly and I to kind of take a look at this and pick this apart. I would say, not surprisingly, and you would notice this in my article as well, Tiger makes a strong showing on this list with, I believe, three entries in their top 20. Tiger gets a bad rap. I get it. Their stuff is simplistic and cheap. That was kind of the appeal, though, as a kid. Like, they were popular. I was there. They were a very popular company for their handheld games. It's when they tried to make the jump into the console market, and still essentially were making these LCD handheld games, but selling them at console prices, that things started to fall apart. And specifically the R Zone, which most people remember as the way worse version of Virtual Boy. Yeah,
I'd
so
just say
Tiger,
worse in a different way.
yeah,
I wouldn't say way worse.
Yeah, worse in a different way version of Virtual. Imagine if you strapped Virtual Boy to your head, but only over one eye. R Zone. That's how it worked. So yeah, Tiger just didn't get it. The N Gauge is on here. That's usually on most people's lists. It was a phone that took cartridges to play games on, but it didn't work as a phone or as a game system. That was something that was very popular. I saw and played these, never bought one because it's stupid. Thing. So in order to make a phone call, you had to use the front of it, which was like a number pad, like a phone, but then you had to hold it sideways for the receiver and the microphone. It was awful. And to change out your cartridges, you had to take the phone apart because the cartridges went under the battery. So you had to take the case off, take the phone apart, take out the battery to switch out a card. Super convenient.
Yeah.
when you're on the go. So I mean, a lot of these just make sense that they're on there. Interestingly, the 3DO placed really high, and we've been talking about 3DO. Kelly and I are getting some reviews together for you guys. 3DO is an interesting one to me because it's definitely, I completely see why it failed. I'm enjoying playing a lot of these games. There's some great games on there, but it was crazy expensive. It was $700 in early 90s money, which would be well over $1,000 today. And its best games are just enhanced versions of games that were available on every other platform.
Yeah, and to a large degree, the big interactive movie vibe going on a lot of stuff, which ultimately um a small dose experience. I think some of those are good. Space, I'll argue Space Ace and Dragon's Lair are interactive movies to some degree,
Sure.
and Laserdisc based, and so I'll go that route, and they're cool and they're fun, but that's you don't fill an arcade full of Dragon's Lair. You put
No.
one machine over there in the corner and let people get enjoy some other arcade action before they spend a little time dropping quarters in Space Ace.
Yeah, and there was a few at that time when people were starting to get on the CD-ROM bandwagon. A lot of companies really thought that was the direction it was going to go, was these kind of interactive movie games. And spoiler alert, it didn't go that way. And I have a soft spot for some of them though, just because I remember this being a thing at the time. And specifically Night Trap, I do love. I have a ton of great memories about that game. It is frustrating to play sometimes, but I have a lot of great memories about that game. So there are some of those kind of games that I do enjoy. And I'm enjoying 3DO. There are great games for it, but would I go back and drop thousands of dollars on a console and hardware to play better versions of a handful of games I already had? No. Playing it now in totally legal ROMs that we acquired, it's great.
Yep, the only way. The only way you can play.
My personal favorite one though that I would want to mention on this list is the CDI. CDI was, it's still to me probably the most fascinating of all the failed systems because it had a bizarre marketing campaign. So 3DO kind of marketed, and along with a few other systems, tried marketing themselves as like multimedia systems where you could watch movies. So pre-DVD, there was video CD was a thing for a while. Video CDs didn't really take off here, but they were really big in Asia and went pretty strong into the late 90s and early 2000s. Never really took off here. Their quality is terrible on them because the video is so compressed. So the 3DO and some other systems gave you interactive video CDs, which is basically just having like a scene selection and the ability to kind of jump back and forth between certain scenes. And it's basically an overwrought scene selection option, but we'll get into that when we review some games. That again, interactive movies never took off. CDI though really pushed harder than any of these other ones for the multimedia idea of it. And like instead of shipping with a game, it shipped with an encyclopedia CD-ROM. Now, mind you, they were marketing this as a game system. So imagine, and this was another like $700 system around the same time. So imagine you as a gamer put $700 down on a system, and the packing game was an encyclopedia.
Yeah. And we probably should take a pause for most of our viewers to explain what an encyclopedia is.
Yeah.
Because so back when there were cavemen, if a caveman wasn't sure what the population of the Sudan was, the caveman would go to a series of books that and look it up and pull the book out and hope that the population there, and he or she would get the population number for whatever year that encyclopedia was printed. So it could be 5 years old, could be 10 years old, or whatever. There wasn't a magic box that you could ask these questions to that would immediately give you a up-to-date answer.
Yeah, and it had a lot of that kind of stuff for it. It was definitely more software, like a consoleized CD-ROM for a PC. way more software than games, but the games are really why it's worth talking about. So I only ever played one at a store in a display. The games were weird and they were marketed even stranger because if you saw their commercials, they really put the software first. And their commercials, again, weird for a game console, something that they're trying to sell as being 90% a game console. Super weird marketing ploy to really hang to die on that hill of you can look at the encyclopedia or this or that. Super weird. But when they would talk about games, they were very like, I don't know, like it almost seemed like some sketchy back alley deal that they would be making. So the commercial would be like, get the encyclopedia, or if you like games, we have some of those too. And they would show like some quick flashes, like it was something you weren't supposed to be doing. You were getting away with something. It was just such a weird marketing campaign, but I have to acknowledge it worked because it made me curious about what the CDI was and what these games are. They weren't good. The only reason the CDI is remembered today is tons of YouTube videos dunking on their Nintendo games. What some of those videos neglect to mention, though, is how important in the history of video gaming that really is. See, Nintendo was working on their own CD-ROM peripheral to go up against the Sega CD. It was called the PlayStation, and it was being developed with Sony. And Nintendo decided that CD-ROMs weren't going to take over. They were going to stick with cartridges, and they told Sony to go ahead and keep that stupid PlayStation thing because that'll never come back and bite them. They didn't need that. And they took the couple of CD-ROM titles that they were planning and gave them to the only system that mattered on CDs, the CDI. So you get what would have been the PlayStation launch titles, which are Mario and Zelda games that are fully voiced and barely playable. But what's interesting is they are fully voiced. Nintendo for a while tried to pretend these games didn't happen. And I remember as recently as like 5 or 6 years ago, there was a Zelda game that finally had fully voiced cutscenes, and Nintendo actually tried marketing that as the first fully voiced Zelda game. And that's when everybody on the internet jumped in and was like, no, it's not. If you remember your experiment with the PlayStation, which ended up on the CDI, yeah, and they're so bad. And there's plenty of people who dunk on the voice acting on 90s CD-ROM games. This is the best or worst, depending on how you choose to look at it. And I mean, just fascinating stuff. Were there any systems that really stood out to you, sir?
So I was irritated that Jaguar was on the list.
Hmm.
I felt Virtual Boy was in the appropriate place at the
Yeah,
pantheon.
I think it's hard to argue. It
Dude.
should. I don't know if I would make it one, but it's always going to be in the top couple.
Yeah, and there were a few. So I think uh, I was glad to see Pippin on the list.
Yeah, it's
Just
one that doesn't
because,
get enough hate.
yeah, just because of the hubris behind Pippin in general. It was so Mac people like. It
Yeah,
was
that was
just,
on my list too, and I used it to just bash Apple people.
yeah, it was just like I just So I was glad to see it there. I wasn't sure and where the line was. Atari 5200 again. Bad controller. Give it its props for there. Game selection kind of weak in that a lot of it was upgraded 2600 stuff. So
Yeah,
I
that's
get
that's
that.
mostly what I know about the 5200 is that it was a lot of just ports of 2600 games with some more color and stuff.
Yeah, so I just of a 20 worst, and it was kind of middle of the pack. It's like, well, if you're gonna put it in there, it should be towards the bottom, which is kind of like the top of the worst list.
The best of
But
the
I,
worst.
I wasn't sure that it necessarily belonged. But again, not knowing where the line was drawn, it seems like it's at least like they were going for at least second generation or beyond, because what my opinion should have been on the Odyssey should have been on this list.
Yeah.
as far as an experience goes. But that may just be, it's also, for its time. Um, I mean, it okay, sorta, but I mean, this was a cursor game. This was I'm going to move a cursor around the screen, and you're going to put clings on your TV screen, because again, kids, back in the day, TVs generated enough static electricity because there was a small nuclear power plant running behind them of electrical stuff that generated enough of a charge that you could stick plastic to the screen quite easily. And you'd have these overlays, and oh, you're in a haunted house, oh, you're playing tennis, oh, you're doing a race, and not much better than Stratomatic football or something like that. Um, so I would have liked to have seen it on the list. Like I said, I was glad to see Pippin on the list because I got a lot of hate for Pippin. I felt they got kind of the top parts right. A few of them that just super unfamiliar with. And then Naun or Nuon,
Yeah,
didn't
I
know
think that's
about it.
the only one that I had no familiarity with.
Yeah, so there were a couple of the console slash phone experiences I don't have much awareness of, but yeah, overall. But I think and none of this is a criticism of the article or the list, because that's what these things are great for, is to say, hey, we're staking out some ground, we're saying this and our rationale behind it. Everybody can have their own opinion on it, so it's just kind of fun to go back through and see where you fall on some of these things and do it. So I do. I thought it was a fun list and well done, well articulated. I said I quibble with I wouldn't have I would prefer, and maybe this is the Atari tokens in me speaking, but I don't think the 5200 Jaguar belonged on this list. I think the Odyssey definitely did. And you can move Pippin up a little bit. Our zone, it seemed to be about in the right spot. Tiger was well represented for a reason,
Yeah.
so that was all good
And I'm a
there.
fan of Tiger, but I also agree that these three attempts at consoles were awful.
Yeah, and I'm just glad the CD32 dodged the swipe, you know, because I can see where some might make the case, but in that case, you at least have a good controller for the
Yeah.
CD32, and by and large, you're just getting an Amiga, which is a pretty darn good game system. So,
Which I feel like maybe it wasn't included only because they kind of already did that with the consoleized C64. So
yeah,
I mean, it's essentially the same thing. That was a consoleized Amiga that didn't take off because if you already had an Amiga, you would just use that.
yeah, yeah. Or it's, oh, well, you can make it a 500. You just have to add a hard drive and a keyboard and a monitor, and you're like, all
And
right,
you're
just go
back to a
buy
PC.
go buy a 500.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I thought it was a pretty cool list, but this has definitely got me thinking as we've done it, that we'll have to. Um, sorry, folks, you're getting some show prep on the air. pitching Mike the next idea. Um, we should collect a couple of our friends. I'm thinking Mel is definitely one of them that we'd want to bring in here and have a little bit of a retro gaming quiz show,
Okay.
where we have like 3 or 4 of our friends on live, and we would, like, name the system, and all we do is show controllers, and they'd have to kind of name and some of those things like that, and whoever could buzz in, we'll have to figure out some logistics on how that'll work. um I like the idea of making the people we have on say buzz, so it'll be like,
I think that's it. I think that's the most highly technical and precise way that we could approach that.
yeah. But then if we have like Nikki Biller back on, you're going to say, oh, I heard Nikki buzz first. And, I'll be rampant cheating from there. But yeah, we'll have to play around. But I think it'd be fun to kind of do that. Maybe some off characters to say which which system was this guy running around in most of the time. So I think that could be a kind of a fun thing. If anybody's watching, we made it through this far, and this is the kind of thing you'd be interested in doing, let us know in the comments, or ping us on Twitter or Instagram, and let us know if you'd be interested in taking up the challenge. But we think we should do something like that and come up with a fabulous prize for the most gamer knowledgeable.
Bog Panda.